I am delighted to welcome to the stage Lars Fruergaard Jørgensen, President of EFPIA and CEO of Novo Nordisk.
So, are there any symbols in which chair I check?
Come and sit with me. That's, yeah. Thank you very much. So this is what we call a fireside chat. We don't have a fire, but we are going to have a chat again. I have lots of questions I want to ask Lars, but I also hope to hear from all of you, either on the screen, still getting some very long questions, if you keep them short, and I'll come out to you with the mic as well. But Lars, can we go back to where we started this afternoon? Because we watched a video at the beginning of this event, and EFPIA has had this campaign this year which asks us to imagine, and I'm quoting, that healthier, more competitive Europe which delivers scientific and medical breakthroughs first, transforms the lives of patients and changes the course of public health while driving economic growth, resilience and security. There is a lot of elements to that vision. Can I just ask you, and particularly in the current challenging context that we face, where would you start? Where do we begin to tackle all of those issues?
Yeah, that statement, and I agree, it's a lot of sentences also on that statement compared to your comment from before. That represents actually the vision of EFPIA. And I think we have a very unique opportunity as an industry in the sense that by doing innovation, we strengthen the health of the population. A healthier population takes a burden off healthcare systems. It also makes people more productive. And when we adopt innovation, we also create stronger industries. It leads to tax payments, which then again enables that we can fund healthcare. So I think it's a very, very unique proposition that when we get this right together, we can really strengthen both Europe as a region, but also industry and the population of Europe.
And you say, when we get this right, how hopeful are you that we can get this right? Because we've talked a lot this afternoon about Mario Draghi's report on competitiveness, which really highlights what a critical moment this is and how, as we've heard all afternoon, the pharmaceutical sector in Europe is falling behind in global share of R&D, clinical trials and so on. Give us, if you can, some optimism.
But I think we will get it right because for me, the opportunity is so obvious. And of course, when you work in our industry, you have to be an optimist because when we start a research effort, it perhaps on a good day has a 5% likelihood of turning into a product. So we have to be optimists. But for me, what has happened over the past couple of years is also a wake-up call for Europe that we need to come together in new ways to make sure that we stay a resilient part of the world. And so I think geopolitics, I think the pandemic, as we also just heard, has made it very current for us what it means to have a strong ecosystem where we translate science from academia into startups. That was a comment from before, that from the startups we can feed the drug development cycle in the pharmaceutical sector. When the incentives are right for that, businesses take huge risk. And when we succeed, there is an opportunity to get a return on that investment by adopting the innovation and bringing that to Europeans, becoming more productive, healthcare systems becoming stronger, etc. So for me, it's a lot about that ecosystem that I think the panel also touched upon. And that's why I think it would be a really great idea if the Commission had a life science office that was focused on connecting all the dots. The panel spoke about public research. I think we need to figure out how do we reward, say, public institutions for their contribution to science. But we also have to acknowledge that no public institution has ever developed a medicine, maybe perhaps, chemical warfare applied drugs, and that's not what we want to do. So understanding that ecosystem, that we need academic institutions to do basic research, but that doesn't turn into products unless there's an industry that knows how to optimize, say, new approaches, turn it into druggable medicines and develop that. And of course, if we then look at that, if there was a public funding, the drug price should be cut. I think that takes down the incentive for actually developing medicines. I would rather figure out how do we reward the academic institutions for their contribution in a way where we stimulate the market, the appetite for taking risks, but of course not taking undue advantage of what the public gave to the industry, if that's what's being perceived.
And what we're trying to identify in this conversation is how to find a cure for competitiveness, title of the session. One of the issues, and you just mentioned that turning the basic research into products, one of the issues for Europe does appear to be this translation. So to go from research to innovation and from innovation to market. Why do you think that is so difficult in Europe?
I think we have, compared to US, China, which we increasingly compare ourselves up against, I think we have a different culture in our academic institutions that sometimes it's actually seen as collaborating with the devil if you actually translate your science into business. If you compare to China, to US, it's simply a prerequisite. If you take a US university that's a private institution, unless you can figure out translating your science into something that turns into money, you have a problem in running your university. Compared to Europe, where it's to a large degree public-funded academia. So we need to figure out how do we actually create an understanding in Europe that if we want to strengthen competitiveness of Europe, we also need to understand what does translation of science means. And I acknowledge that not all scientific domains are easy to monetize, so we also need the non-monetizable research because of our cultural, heritage. But we need to simply be more, driven in what does it mean to foster innovation in Europe. And there, the comment about VC backing is a key one, because today, if you do have a professor that does great science, it turns into a startup company. The moment you need to do an IPO or get funding significantly for that, you most likely end up moving your activity to the US, because that's where the price of that is set much higher than it is in Europe. And you get much more funding. And by the way, it's also the market where you first can do the clinical trials. And it's, by the way, also the market where the regulator fastest approves the products. And it's also the market where you can scale sales, because you don't have to go to 27 countries. So I'm not trying to be a pessimist here. I'm really trying to figure out how do we collaborate to take those barriers away so we actually keep the science in Europe. We do make sure that there's VC funding for that great idea. That means that more likely it's one of the European pharmaceutical companies that will pick it up. If there's fast access to doing clinical development, the clinical development will also be done here. Where you do the clinical development, you also typically end up producing, because you need to translate from, CMC product development into manufacturing. So the likelihood of actually having manufacturing domiciled on European soil is also higher. And then you have the whole positive ecosystem, because Europe got stronger, health resilience was improved because it was more likely that Europeans get access to it. And that's really what we need. And that happens when we come together and do policies that are not done in isolation, but actually connecting the dots across a number of domains.
Which links to your call, which I'd like to come back to for a life sciences office to coordinate all of that. Very struck by what you were saying there, because a lot of it very much, it seems Mario Draghi, when he looks at this sector in particular, but across the economy as a whole, you very much share some of his analysis of the problem. And the other issue he raises is that fragmentation of the European market and how difficult it is in terms of the support, EU level, national level support, and so on. I want to come back on that in a moment and what we do about it. But before we do that, can I just ask you a little bit about your company? You've become quite famous, Financial Times Personality of the Year. What do you, and that was put down to the huge success you've had. You've been at Novo Nordisk forever. Started your career there, I think.
Believe it or not, 34 years.
What do you put down? You've now become the biggest company. Just on a personal level, What do you think has been the key to that success? What has driven it? And I'm wondering whether from a story of one company like yours, we can draw some lessons for Europe as a whole.
I think there's one of focus. We are a rather focused pharmaceutical company, only exposed to very few therapy areas and a relative limited number of technologies. So in the focus, you build strength. And if you're then also persistent and keep going and spend decades of research in an area, like obesity, where many for long felt that that's not really a market opportunity. Is it even a disease? Is it worthwhile pursuing? But we have all along felt that if you live with type 2 diabetes and obesity is a precursor for that, why don't we address obesity and prevent the disease? And then I would say also we have an ownership structure where we're controlled by a foundation, which means that we are still in Europe. Had we not had that ownership structure, we would not be a European company. No.
You would have moved to the US? Or
we would have been acquired.
Right.
We would not like to move on our own, but had we not had a foundation that controlled the company, we would have been acquired. And we would no longer be a European-based company, most likely.
And if I can ask straightforwardly, would you say that the policy environment at EU level and indeed at national level has helped or hindered in that journey to becoming Europe's biggest company?
So we talk about how companies operate.
Yeah.
And the company I represent is lucky in the sense that we have, say, done our globalization. So we are a large global company. So we can operate in the US, in Europe, in China, elsewhere. Yeah. So we can live with regulations as they are. We just go where the business opportunity is. Yeah. But if you're a European-based company and you're a small, medium-sized company and you have not yet globalized and you only have business in Europe, you have a big disadvantage. Because if you're not tapping into the US market where the biggest opportunity is, you have a disadvantage, and you are disadvantaged in your ability to invest in your business because you are missing out on the biggest, say, commercial opportunity, the quickest market to enter, and the quickest market to scale in, because it's largely a private market. Now, I don't think most Europeans would like to have a US-type private healthcare market. Most Europeans like what we have. But then I think it's our obligation, policymakers, leaders, industry, to make sure that it works better. And that's why I spend time in EFPIA to engage in dialogues, to make sure that I, as a European, leading a European-based company, that we work really, really hard to make sure that we get it to work in the best possible way. So our great cultural heritage in Europe is reflected in how we put policies in place, how we take care of the weakest citizens in our countries and in our region. There was a comment from before about the US healthcare system and what it cost, typically double up compared to Europe. If you are, in a high societal status, you have excellent care, you have much better outcomes than you have in Europe. But if you fall between the cracks, obviously you have much lower outcomes. And the reason why the average life expectancy is declining in the US is because the bottom is falling out. And typically we don't see that to the same degree in Europe. But in the top of society, the quality of healthcare is lower than it is if you compare that to the US.
Indeed. And this really echoed, it's more of a comment, I think, than a question from someone in our audience saying, considering the difference in costs, workforce expenses and stricter safety regulations in the European Union, how to produce and innovate in the EU without becoming unprofitable. But you've said, we do it everywhere because we can make it work.
It's not a problem to operate and innovate in Europe. But if you're disadvantaged in your ability to commercialize globally, and you can only commercialize in Europe, then you are challenged. Because if we take in Europe, the European Medicines Agency is takes longer time in approving products.
Yeah.
When you have a product that's approved, then you have to go through 27 countries to get to market. And that simply takes years compared to in the US, where you would have the fastest approval typically of all markets, and the day after you can tap into a large commercial opportunity. So the research costs the same, but if you're anchored in Europe and don't have the opportunity to tap into the US, you're simply not getting the return that you can actually keep investing in research and compete and win against competition.
So I want to ask you in a moment, in broad terms, what, as we enter a new EU political cycle, what you want from policymakers, but perhaps as importantly, what you don't want from them, and then really your hopes, your expectations for the new life sciences strategy, which is really at the core, will set the direction of travel for the EU. But before we do that, are there any questions in the room? Perhaps we could bring the lights up again a little bit so I can just see if... yeah, right at the... Can you grab... Is there someone there with a mic? Yeah, there we go. Take that one. It'll be quicker than me coming to you.
Yes, my name is Victoria English, and I'm an editor of MedNow's publication. I have a question about financial incentives. What would be the 3 most important financial incentives that the public authorities in Europe could adapt to stimulate this industry? I mentioned Christine Lagarde, who was quoted in the FT about a week ago, suggesting perhaps tax breaks to encourage people with large savings to bring the savings into the public, onto the public markets.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Any other questions for Lars at this point? Yep, hang on, it's all right, I'll deal with it. There we go, sir.
So, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sebastian, again, Capital for Cures. And this is a Christmas wish list, really. Christmas is coming up, so I would wish also for the industry, really talk to the insurance industry, talk to the pension funds, also within your companies. And they should really also, your own pension funds should invest into next companies. At the moment, they don't do that. So that's something I would wish for Christmas.
Thank you very much indeed. Any others before I go back? Hang on, let me just see. No, so let's take that incentives question particularly.
Yeah, so the pharmaceutical industry is an industry that does not need financial incentives. There are other sectors that has to go through a transition and probably need some financial incentive to do that. We are willing to fund the full risk of what we do, and we experienced in assessing what are those risks and take the full risk. But it only works if there is an incentive in terms of IP, that when we have taken the big risk and developed the product, presented the data for society to decide whether you want to use it, then there is a period to recoup the investment. So there are very few industries where you take all the cost up front and only have a chance to be rewarded if you actually succeeded in doing that. So I would say only say the market incentive in form of IP window. And then there was a discussion about regulatory data protection, which now is 12 years in the US, it's 8 years in Europe. It's being discussed whether it should be reduced to 6. And I would just say if it's reduced to 6, a lot of products is not going to be launched in Europe, because it takes years for EMA to approve the product. And then you need to take years to go to the 27 countries to get to the market. So before that is done, you have a few years to recoup the investment, and that simply doesn't work. So when you reduce that regulatory data protection, it's the peak year sales you remove, and that's what funds the whole risk. And I know what will happen when I go to my CFO. I used to work in finance, so I'm not blaming him. So he would just look at the math and say, what is the likelihood to make a return if it's only 6 years? And it doesn't work. So it's not going to happen. In terms of pension funds, etc., investing, I think it's a really, really good point. In Europe, I think we have to look into financial regulation and what are the risks that pension funds can take, and how do you look at that cross-border. Simply, if you talk to, I would say, 9 out of 10 startup companies that are looking to do an IPO, none of them, 9 out of 10 would not believe that they can do it in Europe. And they'll simply do it in the US. So I have friends who have started up companies spending endless amount of time getting money in Europe because the mindset is not there. So I think there's a cultural element to it, but I think there's also a regulatory element to it. Yeah.
Lars, you said in an interview that I read recently that at this moment of political change, and we are at a pivotal moment for the EU, and I quote, "The EU has a fantastic opportunity to turn today's challenges into a virtuous circle for our future health and prosperity." Many in the pharmaceutical sector have been concerned that Europe is actually going in the wrong direction. They point to the review of the pharma legislation and say, we have a real concern that this may do the opposite of what it is designed to achieve. Do you agree with that? And if you do you see now the life sciences strategy as a way maybe to remedy that and seize that opportunity? What does it need to do if we are to seize this moment?
I believe in Europe. I believe there's great science taking place in Europe. I think we have great institutions, great universities. I think we have a great pharmaceutical industry. I think we have great clinicians. I think we have a good EMA also. But I think we need to make some choice about how we orchestrate all of that. And we need to look at how do we benefit all Europeans. I think many of the political processes are breaking down these years because access to health or access to wealth is not divided largely as large populations want it. So it is a real problem if we politically are not capable of getting all innovations to patients. So as an industry, we also have to come up with solutions. So we have committed to make it very transparent where are we in the regulatory process per country. Because the reality is that it's not all countries who want to adopt our innovation. Unfortunately, we do not seek it to succeed in each and every development process. So we'll make it very transparent where are we in that regulatory process so we can have a substantive discussion about why is a product not on the market. Is it because we cannot agree on price? Is it because a country does not actually want to adopt that innovation? Is it because that this is a particular country that's awaiting a regulatory process in other countries? Because that's also the case to some degree. We are also committed to looking at ways to have what we call equity-based tiered pricing. So acknowledging that different countries have different purchase power. So let's look at how do we make sure that we match the price to that country's purchase power. Of course, that doesn't work then if it means that if we benefit a certain country with a lower price, that then all the products are put into a truck and trucked to Germany or Denmark, and then distributors are making arbitrage on that. But that's the type of commitment we have, and we need to get into that dialogue where we solve the political agenda also, because that's what leads to policies that we find problematic. So I think the message from EFPIA is that we open for dialogue and we want to collaborate. And if there was a life science office, that would be an ideal place to connect the dots. And I come from a small kingdom where we now finally have a king. And there we come together. We are, I think, on the fourth version of a life science strategy where around the table you had academia, unions, biotechs, pharmacos, municipalities, the government, etc., in looking at how do we come together and solve the problem of making sure that there's access to patients for our innovation. That helps the population being more resilient. It takes burden off the healthcare system. It creates a stronger life science sector that funds the whole thing. So together we become stronger and more resilient, and Europe becomes competitive. So I believe in Europe, and I think we have a fantastic opportunity if we come together and solve this together.
And a final question to you, which I've been asking all afternoon, as I say, because we are at this moment of transition to a new parliament. We have a new commission just taken office. And I've shied away. I was before this afternoon going to ask people for their most important priority for action, but the more we've talked and the more we talk about this ecosystem approach that you appealed for and many of the speakers have appealed for. So I want to put it differently to you as to others. In terms of a key next step, where we go from here, if we are to succeed in the search for a cure for competitiveness, what is your advice to policymakers in this room about where we need to start? What's the key next step?
Well, I agree we should get the package done, the pharma revision, because we talk a lot about regulatory data protection, but actually the majority of the package is going to make European life science stronger because there are a lot of, say, modernization of the whole regulatory framework. So we should get that done. But then I think it's really important to understand that we need to foster a system that is favoring innovation. Because that's what makes patients stronger, and it's also what makes Europe stronger. We talk a lot about energy and cost of energy in Europe. We'll never end up having really cheap energy in Europe because we don't have that much energy. Yeah. So it will always be innovation that will create the competitiveness of Europe, and that also goes for the life science sector. So work on what stimulates innovation, and then we have to come together and solve these challenges in a public-private partnership approach.
And on that uplifting note, will you join me in thanking Lars very much indeed for a great conversation? Thank you.